20 years ago, somebody had said to me, at the 26th Annual B.C. Mammal Symposium, Lance will speak about seals and you will speak about killer whales. You're crazy. And here we are multitasking. And I get the same questions that Lance gets. And we're working from similar databases and addressing a very wide and diverse community of people. May talked about some of the research we're doing in terms of trying to assess the abundance and distribution of Chinook salmon to compare southerns to northerns. And in that process, we held, I think it was a half dozen workshops. We met with whale watching company operators to give us a sense of how they understood the behavior of the whales, where they moved, how they traveled. We met with sport fishing guides. We had small workshops. We arrived with these laminated maps and we gave them colored markers to show us the movement of the fish. It totally changed our experimental design. But we also got a sense of the differences between the sport fishing guides' perceptions of where whales are finding fish, and then finding differences in terms of where the whale watching companies were telling us. And it's getting into the deep water versus shallow and the restrictions that some of the sport fishing industry has in terms of where they can set their gear. But it had a big effect on us. But during one of those meetings, one of the guys said to me, "How do we get here?" And it's just like this whole firestorm has taken over, and there's all these management regulations that are coming in. Closed fishing, restrictions on numbers, now the potential to restrict all whale watching, certainly coming perhaps from the United States. So that's what I want to address, and it pushed me to do a little bit of research. But before that, I just want to talk a little bit about numbers and things, because what I find is I think if I ask everybody in this room, and I bet if you ask your friends outside of this room, they can all tell you how many killer whales are there. They'll say there are just 74. Or if they didn't pick up the latest newspaper, they may say they're just 75 or just 76. But they're all very much in tune. And people are quite horrified by this. And yet when you ask them, well, like, how many do you think there should be? And maybe some of you tried that, but you'll get answers of, I don't know, 500, 1,000. And then someone will finally say, well, like, how many were there? And it's true that not that many people have seen the data. Now, the people working on killer whales, they've seen the data and they've known it for a long time, but most other people haven't. This is data that the Center for Whale Research put together. And the early source starts from 1960, and it has a reconstruction of animals that were removed for the aquarium industry. But what you can see in here is that, since in this time, the population has experienced 4 declines. Now, the numbers do hide the fact that the effect of population size in terms of numbers of mature animals and breeders, in terms of sex ratios, they're hidden by this. And the future is very bleak for this population. The question then comes up, what does recovery look like? And I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to where we're going to put in management actions because we want them to recover. And everything's about having them recover. And so the question is, well, what do you want them to recover to? And so right now we've got 74. And without showing the data, if you say to somebody, would you like them back to how many were there in 1960? Before there was a threat from tankers and all the noise and everything else, they go, yeah. And you show them, well, 78. So what are we working for? The fishing restrictions that have been put in place in BC, they'll never be lifted. If whale watching is closed in the moratorium that's proposed by the governors of Washington and Oregon, it'll never be lifted. These will all be here forever because there's no criteria for recovery. What are we working for? And I think this is something that needs to be thought about. We just can't say, or those in charge of the regulation just can't say we want them to recover. What does that mean? Is to get them back to the 78 animals. So I think it's a question of coming up with criteria. It's important that people understand why are they endangered in the first place. And it is due to the simple fact that the population is so small. They have always been endangered. They will always be endangered. They're never coming off the list. So clearly we can't work towards recovery in the sense of having them go to threaten and then not at risk. they're always going to be endangered. So that's not helpful, where it is for species that are much more abundant to turn things around. And so I think that, and it probably should come from the community of people that specialize in killer whales, to really propose some criteria, because without that, there's no hope of getting buy-in from any of the groups that are being regulated. Everybody needs to work together for a common goal to achieve something, but saying we want them to recover, recovery is never going to happen because it's such a vague concept, particularly many of the people saying that have never seen the numbers. So do you want them back to the 80 whales that were present in 1979, the all-time high of 98? Because it appears that they haven't numbered more than 100 for over a century. Do you want them at the long-term average of 83? Or do you want to keep them above 80? I don't know what the right answer is, but I think a combination of working with people that do the modeling and probability analysis and other things, I think we could come up with some criteria that would be very useful. Maybe it's we want to focus on reproductive females. Do we need 15, 20, or 25? We should look at that going back into the past to see what has sustained it to this point. Or maybe we just want to keep them all looking fat and healthy. Whatever it is, we need that, and without that, then I really worry about the regulations because they're being put in place and I don't think they can ever come off unless someone is to push a lawsuit or something else, which is a common way in the US. You to use litigation to change management actions. And I think if we come up with criteria, you'll find buy-in and people all work to a common goal. And I just want to make two other points. One is, and I made this point in the video, that I see the southern residents as being this outlier. Something's really different. And yet the narrative we have in British Columbia is there's something wrong with our salmon in BC. And yes, the Chinook and Coho are not as abundant. They're in poor shape. Some of the Chinook populations will be declared endangered. Things are coming. But at the same time, if you look at the northern residents, and these are really the true BC whales, they're doing great. They've been increasing, there's over 300. And so, well, the public is told that there's no salmon left to eat, maybe not quite that blunt that way, but always in the context of the southern residents. We have to ask the question, well, how come the northerns can make a go of it if there really isn't enough fish for the southerns? And that brings me then to looking at the range of the southern resident killer whales. And this is one thing that has really puzzled me. The discussion is framed within a in my backyard problem. This is a made in BC problem, and we tend not to think about the fact that they've got the biggest range of all the resident populations, at least in terms of the northern residents. And while it's maybe unfair to link in Haida Gwaii, but I think we have to focus on further south, particularly Oregon and California. And by some accounts, over 50% of all the Chinook in North America came from Oregon and California. That's no longer the case. The Sacramento coming down way down here for the south, that probably was one of the most productive salmon-bearing rivers. And it had 4 runs of Chinook. There were spring, summer, fall, and winter Chinook. Huge populations that came in to spawn in the wintertime, coming in fat. And yet, in our discussion, nobody's looking. We're somehow trying to save what they require in the summertime, which, yes, is important, but is the food problem happening in the summer, or is it when they're not here and they're coming back in bad shape? And I think that attention needs to be given to the full habitat and start asking questions about the Columbia River, start asking about the Sacramento River. What happened to the fish? Some of it we know is turned into irrigation. It can account for some of the strawberries we eat and many other things. But it's not part of the discussion. We're just focused on in our backyard, and I think we have to look bigger and think bigger about it. And here we've got the second part here, which is there is overlap between the northerns and southerns, not so much in the Salish Sea, but one has to ask the question, why can the northerns do so well and they're overlapping in a range used by the southerns? And is there a potential there for competition to be occurring? So I would just like to broaden, and before I get into that, the concern about is there enough salmon for killer whales? And I was on this scientific panel. I think there were 8 of us on this panel. And we asked this question, and we had 2 years of workshops, so from 2010 to 2012. And we looked into this long before it became such a huge controversy. And the conclusion was that we felt there was enough salmon in this region for the southern resident killer whales. Fast forward to this spring, we released a workshop report and about the availability of prey. And we looked into, and we had, it was done at the request of DFO and also the National Marine Fisheries Service. And we had both government scientists here as well as independent scientists and academics from Chinook and killer whales. And in this, we considered 3 management actions. We did not recommend closing fishing. We did recommend looking at experimentally restricting the movement of vessels to ensure that the killer whales can get access to the fish. So I was at a meeting Thursday, and it was at the Sport Fishing Institute, and there somebody raised the question, so why did Canada close fishing restricted when the US didn't? And someone said just, well, maybe because they read these 2 reports, which is based on science and data. I don't know why it was ignored in Canada, but I would encourage you to read these reports if you want to understand salmon and know more about it. And the thing is that, and I've learned so much about Chinook, to me, spring, summer, or spring Chinook, they were just all synonyms for king salmon. Well, they're not. The biology is so complex and so different, and I know that I had not fully appreciated it until I got myself involved in this process. So, why are they in trouble? And I would just like to broaden the discussion and get people to look also, not just within our backyard, but out beyond. Let's look seriously at the lack of Chinook in Oregon and California to support the southern residents. And let's also do some thinking about, is there competition? If the southerns were to disappear, I would predict that the northerns would move in. And I think we need to be looking at that too, and perhaps even directing some research to look at interactions between the 2 groups to understand that. So how do we get here? To answer that question, I thought it was a good question when it was asked, and I thought, well, maybe one way was to just approach some media articles. And so what I did is, with the UBC, I forget which department did this for me, it wasn't IT, but one of the other ones, and I just asked them if they could do a search for all media articles that use the word southern resident killer whale in it. And I just wanted to see what the change was over time. And here's what you see. So it starts from 1992, out to, and I did this in April 2018, and I will update it at the end of this year to do the full year. But you see it's been this exponential rise in media interest. In terms of the articles, there's been just over 2,000 articles, 50% in newspapers, and the #1 reporting newspaper is the Times, a colonist in Victoria. They love the southern resident killer whales. Vancouver Sun is second in the Canadian press, 60% written in the past 4 years, 50% in BC, only 10% in the US, although I bet I'm going to find that after this year, there's a lot more US articles. 10% positive, 90% split between neutral and negative. The other thing I want to know was, what were the most frequently used words? And so there I look at the lead, that very first sentence of every newspaper article that tells you the whole story, the who, what, where, when, why. And so we did words, and we did these word doodles. And on here you can see that there's no difference between the years up until 2015, other than endangered came up when COSEWIC listed them. But before that, the keywords were baby and orca and new. And so not much changed, but everything changed in 2016. And this diagram was no longer round and nice, it was square and angry. And if you can read on there, you're going to see words like trans and mountain, pipeline, protection, noise, government approval. And so what happened here is they became the poster child for the anti-pipeline. campaigns. Endangered species and a threat of being put to extinction because of noise or ship strikes, and surprisingly very little discussion about the risk of oil spills. Coming then into the next 2 years, other groups have also seen the wisdom of attaching every cause to killer whales. Whether or not you want to blow up the Snake River Dam, whether or not you want sewage treatment in Victoria, whether it's you want to shut down fishing, everything's being linked, or you want to cull seals, just link it to southern resident killer whales. So that's really how we got here, and then the whole world is sort of in a tizzy, and that's where we are. I do want to also, because I too have got a soft spot for seals. This culling of seals, somebody did ask the question, how real is this? And I want to tell everybody here, this is very real. There is a group called the Pacific Balanced Pinniped Society, and it's a coalition of different individuals. And they have submitted a proposal, is my understanding, to DFO, requesting to cull 50% of all the pinnipeds in British Columbia. It's based on a couple of arguments. The number one is some modeling work that's actually done through UBC, is modeling work led by Carl Walters, and it's linking in data used from DFO and seal trends and information in terms of Chinook as well, suggesting that the models predict that if seals were removed, there would be more Chinook salmon. The proposal would be to see this done as a licensed hunt, and with the meat, and most of the hunters would be First Nations. They're being approached, and many of them are joining in on this proposal. Many of them are very concerned that the seals and sea lions are destroying all the fish. There's nothing left for them to eat. I've heard these statements, and they do believe these sincerely. It was on the national news last night, and again, statements one recalled was one of the fishermen seining up herring and referring to the pigs in the trough. It's very real. It is being considered, and it's got a life. The BC, I think, certainly among the First Nations, as well as from some individuals involved with sport fishing. Proposal is to sell the meat to China. It would not be done as a traditional hunt in the sense of feeding people, which I don't think anybody would have an issue with. But the reality is that people, it's not the best tasting meat, having tasted it. But there is a belief that you could sell it all to China. So Lance touched on many of the reasons that we need to think this through, and I just want to bring it back a little bit more here about the transients and with a little bit more information. And my feeling is, as Lance stated to you, I agree with him, that culling seals will likely harm the transient killer whales. When I was at this meeting, and I gave a talk to individuals attending this annual meeting, I showed some of this data, and previous to this, week before, I was at the Vancouver Club, and I was invited. It was an event hosted by the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and Brian Riddell and I were sitting in 2 armchairs, and we had a conversation for an hour in front of a very small audience. It was filmed, and next thing you know, over 10,000 people have watched this. And people have found it quite interesting. I've received so many emails. But I made a statement in there that, and I haven't actually seen the tape yet, but people sort of wrote to me about this, that I made a comment, something to the effect that transients are feeding on seals in the Saley Sea on a daily basis. And I received some emails basically like, what are you talking about? And these were coming from individuals who have spent tens of thousands of hours fishing. And their comment was basically, I fished all this time, I've hardly ever seen a killer whale. I've never seen one eat a seal. And basically saying that what I said was not right. And of course, this was an armchair discussion. There was no data to be shown. But I've heard stories here. Joan, for example, I've heard her stories. I've heard from many of the whale watching operators. John Ford has filled my ears with this. I remember too in the past that I hardly ever saw killer whales out here and now transients. So I wrote back to the guy and said, you know, it's funny. So you've spent tens of thousands of hours. I hardly see a killer whale. I've only spent a few hundred hours. I see killer whales every time, but I've never seen a Chinook salmon. And I basically said to them, you know, I think you're going to the wrong spots, and I'm probably going to the wrong ones too. But they had a hard time accepting that. So I was pushed to produce some data. And I recall some of the numbers from Joan in past years. But there is data, and it's coming from largely data that Jane Cogan has compiled. And she's done an amazing job. So I spoke with her, I spoke with Ken Belcom, and I'm going to show you some of the data in case anybody has any doubts. So this is more than just impressions. This is real data. So this is from 2017, the full year. It's from the Central Salish Sea and Puget Sound. And what they did was to compile information. This is like the perfect example of citizen science. Data coming in from the whale watching boats, from the sightings networks, but it's all confirmed IDs of animals. And what was noted is that, counter to perhaps some people's perceptions outside of this room, they were observed on over 280 days in 2017. That's virtually every day. Some days are over 45. I think the highest number was 62 on one day. And this really caught me. Over 225 unique individuals. So most of these, there's probably fewer than 20 that were from the California transients. They're almost all from the West Coast transients, which number probably just over 350. And so you're getting somewhere between 60 to 70% of the entire population is feeding in the Salish Sea. And in chatting again with Jane and Ken, they suspect that probably every single transient whale comes here at some point in its life. And most noteworthy too is, as Jonah pointed out, there's several new calves, and also there's some new individuals that have not been documented to be here before. Okay, those are just numbers. Let me just show you the real data here. So Jane compiled this, the number of days with transient sightings in 2017, starting from January out to December, and here's the data. So April to October, this every day, and of course, the reason why few were seen on those small craft warning days, oops, I just said it, there aren't people out looking. But I think that if we did have the ability to search every single day, this whole thing would be full green. The other interesting thing is just like, where were they? Are there hotspots? We always talk about that in biology and ecology, hotspots and where they go. Well, here's the map showing you the confirmed sightings in 2017. It's almost like they're randomly distributed. And it kind of makes sense when you realize that, you know, their mode of operandi is not to ever overfish. It's to go, strike, and move on. But you also see that this is only showing you data here from the central part, south. And I think if we could fill in the northern part, it would be peppered green again, as seals have redistributed, probably because of predation pressure from killer whales. And here's another really fascinating data set, again from the same one. And this is the number of individual animals seen starting in April out to September, and with the highest mark on there being 70 animals per day. And here's what the data looks like. So you can see not just different variability in terms of numbers coming across, but also some days where you've got over 60 animals. And so once we start doing the math in terms of the numbers of seals being removed, I think we can explain why harbor seals have been stable for the past 20 years. So, as I'm wrapping up here, counter to what's being said in the media and to politicians and others, our seals are not at an imbalance. The seal numbers are balanced. The killer whales are doing that. Removing them, I believe, is going to cause the transients to decrease. We can probably model that as well, and then you'll need a recovery plan to help save them when you know what the cause is already. The other thing is, my sense is, in looking ahead, that this is going to go a bit further yet, and it will come in the media. And if it ever does come out, I showed the individuals there, particularly those that have got companies that are interested in not only catching fish, and having clients that come out, but also celebrating this incredible place we have. As much as people may not like to have a seal take a fish off their line, they do still enjoy seeing wildlife and particularly seeing killer whales. So I said, here's the headline that I see coming for your future if this goes ahead. It'll be something like this: killer whales starving as BC slaughters seals to feed China. Just look at the optics behind this. Doesn't make any sense. BC promotes, all its tourism literature has a killer whale on it. And yes, people don't know the difference between a resident and a transient perhaps, but they sure will. Nobody around the world knew what a Chinook salmon was until it was linked to southern killer whales. Nobody cares much about seals, but they all will care once we talk about transient killer whales. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to turn this into a bit of a discussion. I know there's lots of people here with lots of expertise on the situation. I'm also happy just to get a beer.
Dr. Trites, when you talked about seals, were you just talking about harbor seals or all seals?
So I was referring to harbor seals. And if you look, so we have about 40,000 here in the Salish Sea, and the province-wide about 100,000. And their numbers seem to be stable overall and have been. Although it may well be that the transients are now causing a decline in harbor seals. It's certainly not sustainable. The numbers of transients has been going up. And so I think that the cull that some of the groups would like to see, it's already happening. But it's happening in a supernatural BC way. And as I think it should be as well. So the sea lions, though, they are also now forming a bigger part of diets, I think, of the transients. They just have to be. We're seeing them still rising exponentially, but, and we're also seeing new breeding sites being established for stellar sea lions. But they haven't hit K yet. They're not at carrying capacity. The one thing that was so shocking with the harbor seals was we saw them like going to infinity and beyond, and then they just stopped. And that was like totally unexpected. And so we may well see the same thing happen with sea lions. There's some indication that coming out of California, the sea lions we have here from California are just the males. The females aren't coming here, but in the last 4 or 5 years, their numbers have been kind of jagged and appear to be stable, perhaps, although there's also been the blob, El Niños, that are affecting things. But there's some thinking that may be stable, and our stellar sea lions are not yet. They are still increasing. Anything else?
We did have an online question that I could just quickly insert here. It's more of a statement connected to a question. A member of an NGO in Washington just says the growth, and that's in reply to the question, how many seals, how many killer whales we should have in the population. And she just says, it should exceed 200 members to reach historical levels. And she's referring to a paper from 1972 by Palo, who's estimating 225 to 300 whales for our waters. And the question connected to is basically, we have the numbers. What are your thoughts on that, if you could?
So I'm not familiar with that paper, and I will go look for it. I do question sometimes people's best guesses about how many were here. Certainly at that time, there would have been very poor understanding of the distinction between the different types or ecotypes of whales, and there wasn't that much dedicated research perhaps even to come up with those estimates. So my guess is they were best guesses. And with a background in modeling, I'm very familiar with best guesses. It's like, how many do you think? That seems reasonable. So I think it's worthwhile to go back and look. But I know from what I've heard about some of the genetic analysis in terms of trying to estimate possible previous populations, it would appear that they've not, at least for 100 years. But I would have thought that had we still had the Sacramento River producing Chinooks, still if the Columbia was, we may well have a population of 200 or 300. But I think what we're seeing is a population that has been at carrying capacity since 1960, and just reflects the fact that salmon runs have been poor overall. But it's a good question and something that needs to be looked into.
So we've heard a few of you talk about culling the seals would probably lead to a decline in the transients, and heard Lance talk about how they feed probably on estimate around 30,000 seals per year. So has no one actually done the predictive models to indicate that this would be the case, seeing as you have the evidence, the population trends that show to the media that?
There have been, I remember Peter Lysiak presenting some numbers where he calculated the numbers of pinnipeds that would be consumed by transients. And he did it and basically showed that it takes a very few number of whales that can explain the missing animals, because not every animal that's born lives and adds to the population. So that math was done. The part that's not been done is to look at what's the consequence if you reduce the size of the seal population. And that's looking at it in a different way to make a projection. So some people have said, you know, actually, if we reduce the seal population, they're going to become more productive. They're going to produce more. Going to have pregnancy rates go up. So there's actually going to be more food for them. Well, having worked in northern fur seals on the Pribilof Islands, that was the argument made that almost destroyed the entire population. It was faulty thinking in the model. So it's one thing if a population is of seals at carrying capacity because it is food limited, and you reduce it, then you expect then to release it so it does have more pups. I'm not hearing from Marty or others that they're getting all these emaciated seals that are because the food has been overeaten. They all appear to be healthy, which suggests to me that they're at carrying capacity because of predators. So reduce that, you're not going to get more. They're already pumping out lots of pups. They're a healthy population, and they're kept healthy, largely I think because of the transient killer whales.
Andrew, I'm a little troubled by the, and I've seen you deliver this a few times now, the discussion about the trends in the numbers of killer whales, of southern resident killer whales over the last few years, over the last 40 years. I don't see why 1960 is a magic baseline. There are papers. I did one. The Palo one is another one. The reconstructions of salmon, as you said at the end, suggest that the population was much higher. And I mean, I think, and John Ford used to make this exactly the same case that you did. He said, you know, we have to be careful talking about them declining. But John did it differently. John said, we have to be careful about what time period we're talking about when we talk about a decline. And he always talked about a much longer time period. You know, you agreed that the 74 animal, you know, population size right now is in dire straits, and demography is part of that. So I think, this is a great conversation to have over beer between colleagues like us. I don't think that's a great thing to put in front of the public because it really confuses them. Scientists can't even agree on whether the population is declining. You know, so I would counsel you not to do that. It's up to you, of course, but I don't think it's helpful. Secondly, I think this case that you make that when regulations come into place, they never come off again, is wrong. And I think it's very inflammatory. I think the public look at that and go, God, if I'm a sports fisherman, every time there's a rule, I'm stuck with it for life. Because you're right, it may not come off because the population has recovered. I was at a meeting last week where there was, within DFO, where there was a lot of discussion about these things. And those regulations will come off if they're not effective. And effectiveness, it doesn't have to be measured by the recovery of the population. It can be easily measured by, in other ways, by, is it having the desired consequence? If you put sport fish closures on an area that you think is an important southern resident killer whale foraging area, and the southern resident killer whales never go there, the regulation comes off.
So maybe
Will come off.
Let me just do a couple of questions.
There's lots of other things. I have to do with the first part of the talk.
So the reason I say that I don't see them coming off is because they're all being linked to not being effective. They're being linked to recovery, but that's not. Well, I've heard this. Well, I was just at meetings this week where I heard some comments made about we want them to recover, and so I think it's still coming down. And effectiveness means to get to that point of seeing the desired response, which is recovery. But what does that mean? It's a very vague concept. But the other point. I just lost my thought on that. Yeah, it's almost beer time. No, I know the other point I want to make on that is one of the things we did in our workshop report is we were all very adamant that if you put in a management action, you need to put in a research program to monitor if it has any effect. That was not done. And so, yes, it was closed, and we're not going to know if it actually resulted in more fish or not. There's no study done. And that's my biggest disappointment, is if we put in action, we have to learn from it. We just can't go to bed at night, sleep quiet, and think, yeah, we did the right thing. I'm sure it's working. We can collect data to evaluate it. And I agree, if that was being done, then I'm on board with you and saying we could show that it made no difference, so why are we doing it? But that's not been done. And the last point I just make in terms of earlier comment is that I see myself as a professor at a university. We're in the business of education. We're in the business of talking to students, training students. We're also in the business of talking to stakeholders and talking to everybody that's in this room. And yes, we could well do, for example, a symposium that only the purebred researchers get to talk or speak together about it. But we're streaming this. And I think that we have a responsibility to share our knowledge, raise questions, challenge conventional wisdoms, but be open-minded in the process. And if some of the comments I made today stimulate people to think, wait a minute, I've got a problem, well, let's sit down and talk about it. Because I think it's through this dialogue that we're going to find the solutions. They're going to help southern resident killer whales and going to help transient killer whales too. And that may be, oops.
There's been a lot of focus on the predators as, you know, at one end of the spectrum. So whether it's sport fishermen or whether it's seals. But what about the other end of things, which is the prey availability and habitat enhancement? You touched on it briefly in terms of what's happening in the U.S. and the loss of prey down there. But, you know, do you think that there's enough being done about prey availability here?
So I don't think there's enough being done on either side of the border to really address this question. And when we say the word prey availability, it's a loaded term. And we try not to use that word because it's confused with abundance and accessibility. And these are two separate things. We want to make sure that the abundance is high enough, but also that the fish that are there are accessible. And so it may well be that in our reports that we did that the abundance is sufficient, but the whales can't access them because they're losing opportunity to get to them. And both are testable hypotheses and data, and certainly the data that May Sato and I are working on is focused really on that abundance part, but we're not looking at the accessibility. And some studies have been done in the past, but I think they can be better focused. And it requires working collaboratively with the stakeholders as well to get their collaboration and cooperation, to collect the data to understand whether or not the mental models we have about how we think that system works is right or not.
Coming from across the border, this is clearly a binational issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious how much collaboration is going on, if you know, not only between researchers, but also between governments.
I think my impression is that on one level there is a lot of cooperation. Certainly when we ran the workshop, we had everybody coming together, and I felt it's a very constructive group of people. I think all looking to find solutions. At the same time, though, once we go home, it's almost like there's that line, and there's not the same flow that you would expect. So on one level, yes, there's cooperation, but at the end of the day, people work within their own institutions, and those are often delineated by borders. So it's kind of a yes-no, and probably at the end of the day, more can be done. But I don't quite know what the path forward is on that, other than there's still a lot of conversations between the key players.
So my data looked back at 3 years to 2016 because, anyway, I wasn't really looking at this in 2015. For those of you with a longer memory, 2015 was an awesome year for Chinook salmon. There were a lot of babies born, and when we talk about foraging areas for the southern resident killer whales, What I noticed is that the only people that are really making observations of southern resident killer whales around the Fraser River and the banks and down to Point Roberts, whale watchers. Where are you researchers? Because those whales on a good Chinook year, when the Chinook are running, come up here and they'll stay for 2 or 3 days. They're probably foraging at night because they're resting during the day. So, you know, if the salmon are there, the whales are doing their thing, and this is one area where I feel like it's really been overlooked as far as research goes, to know what they're doing, and this has to be one of their prime foraging areas. There's very little actually seems to be known about it.
Right, and that's a good point. It's, you know, it's something just within BC, the Canadian government has spent a huge amount of money over the past year and a half investing in killer whale research. And a lot of money is being spent. You heard a little bit from May's talk, and you saw a little bit in the video, in terms of a piece of that. Lance has got a program. You heard touches of that today. There's a program over at UVic. DFO has a huge program as well, which was not presented today. We actually have to get together ourselves. We need our own workshop just to compare notes, because we're all, at this point, sadly, kind of working individually. And I think we do need to get together. And part of that is just, well, we just finished a busy field season. We're all pushed for time. And gosh darn, it's the Annual B.C. Marine Mammal Symposium. And now it's Christmas coming. But we do have to cut out time. And I think it's time for us to sit down and have some of the conversations, like for Lance and I, to really nail it down with others too. And hopefully come up with, you know, speaking from the same page more often than not. But at the same time, I think that having these sorts of discussions is very healthy. None of us has the answers, but collectively I think we can find the right answers and the solutions. See a question back there, and I'm just conscious that we're hitting 5, and one more up there. Go ahead.
Hi, you've mentioned some trends dating back to the 1960s, with the all-time high in, I think, 98. You mentioned. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of management initiatives or limitations that have been known to influence the population.
So I don't think I quite understood. If there's any management
Limitations or initiatives that have actually influenced the population trends?
The only one was the decision in the 60s to remove whales for the aquarium industry. Other than that, it's been pretty much hands-off. They've done their own thing. And, you know, I'd say on the biology side, I don't recall any biologists ringing the alarm bells. There's a real problem. Not that some people weren't really concerned about them, particularly over the past 7-8 years. But it is now front and center. And I know it's taking up a lot more of my bandwidth. It's taking a lot more of the bandwidth of practically every stakeholder in BC that works on the ocean as well. So we're getting management in there, but again, there's so much being done. We still need to sit down and compare notes. But I think like next year, we should have even more data. May is going to show us Johnson Strait, summer, winter. We've also put in for a very big grant to collaborate with others with the Pacific Salmon Foundation to start catching and tracking salmon that killer whales depend on. Do more fine-scale tracking just using hydrophones and arrays. And if this goes forward, it's going to be a huge boon to really figuring this thing out. So there's a huge momentum underway. And I think next year you're going to hear a lot more research, and more than just here's what we were doing, but here's what we found. And these are the questions we now have. Done?